Today's presentation will be given by Jennifer Lin, who worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer for 31 years, including postings as a financial correspondent in New York, a national reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Knight Ridder newspapers, and the Asia correspondent for the Inquirer and the 30-paper Knight Ridder chain. Lin left daily journalism in 2014 to complete her family memoir and to start work on a documentary entitled Beethoven in Beijing, which captures the flourishing of classical music in China through the history and ongoing engagement of the Philadelphia Orchestra. A graduate of Duquesne University, Lin lives in Doylestown, Pennsylvania with her husband, Bill Steig, who is also here today. He was a Wolverine and a former sports editor of the Michigan Daily. So lots of Michigan connections here, and Jennifer's family is also here with them today. Today, Jennifer will be speaking on From Cook to Counterrevolutionary, a window into Christianity in China through the saga of a single family. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Lin.
Thank you, Joseph. So thank you, everyone, for coming out today. And it is truly an honor to be here at the University of Michigan because, truth be told, I've been a Wolverine wannabe from the time I started dating Bill Steig, who is a third-generation Michigan man. And I'll never forget the first time he took me to Ann Arbor to go to a football game. I went to Duquesne, where football was a club sport. And I remember marching in with the band and sitting at the 50-yard line and feeling like I was Margaret Mead, who had just arrived on the shores of Samoa, because there were rituals and chants and tribalism. So anyway, it was my introduction to Michigan, and I embraced the cult, and I became a member of the honorary member of the cult. But I am proud to say that there is now a member of the Lin clan who is a baby Wolverine, my nephew Drew. So anyway, I know what you're all thinking. Why is she wearing then Buckeye red? And sometimes fashion trumps sports. So here I am. And as Joseph said, I'm here to talk about my family memoir, Shanghai Faithful. And really, through the story of the Lin family, you will understand how Christianity took root in China through the story of my relatives. So to begin with, a little bit of history on U.S.-Sino relations. The nice thing about talking to a group like this is I don't have to do a lot of explaining of the history of modern China, but just to recap, 1972 was a very vital year because that's when President Nixon made his historic trip to China and began the process of opening up relations with China. So for my family, that was also a very important year. Now, my father, Paul Lin, he left China in 1949. He was part of the great diaspora of people who left in advance of the communist victory. It was apparent that the People's Liberation Army would be victorious. And my grandfather, who also studied in the United States, told his children that if they wanted to go, they should probably leave now to study, to continue their study. So from 1949 until later, the only way my family could communicate with the family that my dad left behind was through letters. So we would write every month to Shanghai, and my grandfather, who was fluent in English, would write back to us. But we had to assume that these letters would have been opened and read by the authorities. Every letter that we sent, every letter that they sent to us, because, as I said, the United States and China were not allies at that time. So there would have been a lot of suspicion about letters going back and forth. But after 1972, we were allowed for the first time to place a phone call to Shanghai. And I'll never forget the day when we stood in my dad's office and we called Shanghai and we spoke to my grandfather for the first time. And it was the one and only time I heard his voice, and he died soon after. So that was a very momentous moment for the family. Another little bit of history, 1978. The reason this was important was this was when President Carter renewed relations with China. So that meant embassies were opened in Beijing and in Washington, and it became very easy then for families like mine to get a visa to travel to China. It's hard to imagine today, but back then you really needed a special reason to go to China. You needed an invitation from some group. And so Carter renewed relations in December of 1978, and my dad very quickly got visas for us to travel back to meet the family he left behind. So by that time, his parents had passed away, but he had a sister and a brother who were still living in Shanghai. Now, my mother couldn't come with us because we planned on staying in the family home in Shanghai. They still had the house where Dad grew up in the international settlement. And the reason was my mother, who was an Italian from Camden, New Jersey, was considered a foreigner. But since we were half Chinese, we were considered overseas Chinese, and China really wanted people like us to come back. So by June, Dad got visas for myself and for two of my sisters, and together we went with him for a family reunion in Shanghai. I always talk about this picture because I'm very proud of this photograph. It's the precise moment at the Hongqiao airport where Dad met his sister for the first time after 30 years. And what I like to remind the young people in the audience is back then you had to make sure your camera was focused and the f-stop was right and the speed and the ASA. So I actually captured that very moment. And I remember the first hours of this family reunion were very joyous and happy because I was a 20-year-old college student meeting my cousins for the first time. And up until then, they had just been faces in photographs or names in letters. And for my father, too, this was a wonderful time because he was going back home. He was staying in the house he grew up in the international settlement on Jiaozhou Road, if anyone's familiar with Shanghai. And he saw his older brother and his older sister. So the first hours of this family reunion were all sweetness and smiles. And the first morning, though, in Shanghai, I'll never forget waking up, at dawn, and standing out on the porch of the second floor bedroom where we were staying, my sisters and I, and just listening to the bells, from the bicycles, as people were making their way to work. And I will never forget hearing my father coming down the steps. He was staying on the third floor, and turning around and seeing the look on his face because he was ashen. And there was this look of shock, of profound sadness. And I remember him saying, "My God, it's so depressing to be here." And what happened was the night before, after we went to bed, Dad stayed up with his Uncle George, who was, oops, what did I do there? You told me this might happen. He said, "Don't hit that button underneath."
Well, if you do, just hit it again. Oh, what has happened here? That's very odd.
Okay. We've been sabotaged.
One moment, please. Thank you for your...
Just at my big moment, too, in the narrative.
Here we go.
Okay.
That thing is not a mouse. It's merely a...
Okay, let's go back here. There we go. Okay. So Uncle George spent the night talking to Dad. And Uncle George was the younger brother of my grandmother. And he said to Dad, he said, "Do you have any idea what's happened to us since you've been gone?" And the truth of the matter was, we didn't. We were getting all these letters, but as we later realized, all the letters were sanitized. And we knew that China had just gone through this brutal period called the Cultural Revolution, where, basically society fell apart. What we didn't know until that night was how the politics of the period had played out within the walls of the family home. And the other relatives didn't say a word to Dad about this. It was only Uncle George. The others were too afraid to tell him anything. But Uncle George sat Dad down and told him what had happened to the family during the Cultural Revolution. So my grandfather, Reverend Lin Puqi, was accused of being an American spy. His wife had it worse. She was accused of being an enemy of the people, a counter-revolutionary. And the main reason was because of her brother. Her brother was a man named Watchman Nee. Now, is anyone familiar with that name? So Watchman Nee was a very prominent religious leader, but in the 1950s he was arrested and he was sentenced to 20 years in a labor camp. He was considered a number one counter-revolutionary. So it was guilt by association. And what my father found out is just how traumatic the Cultural Revolution was for his mother. She was basically singled out. She was interrogated on a regular basis. She was beaten. She was forced to confess her sins every day to her neighbors by kneeling in the courtyard of, where they lived and admitting her, quote, sins. So Dad was just learning this for the first time. He also just learned that there was one day in August of 1966 when the Cultural Revolution exploded in Shanghai, and gangs of Red Guards went to house, attacking people who were considered bad elements. And my family had many checks against them. They were intellectuals, they were capitalists, and they had Western ties. So on this one day in August, 3 groups of Red Guards came to the family home and ransacked it. And they took away possessions, they carted away furniture, they tore up photographs, they destroyed albums. My cousin had an upright piano, gone. Her sheet music was torn up and burned. So this was in one night. And this was what Dad was learning for the first time. Now for my father, obviously this was very traumatic. This family reunion turned into just a very emotional time for him. But what's interesting is when we went back to Philadelphia, Dad, who was a surgeon, kind of took what he knew, put it in a box, and put it away. There was no way he was going to go back in time to undo history. There was no way he could go back and help his mother, through this difficult time. So Dad moved on. But I was, becoming the journalist I wanted to be, and I couldn't let go of what I had learned. And so I just became, as my father said, obsessed with the question of what happened to my family and why. So I was in a very good place professionally to pursue this because from the time I was in high school, I knew I wanted to be a newspaper reporter. It was just in my blood. So as I was traveling to China for the newspaper and then eventually stationed there for 4 years in the 1990s, I began really mining the family story. And I used the tools of a reporter to basically piece together the family history. And so, I treated this assignment as I would an investigative piece. So I did a lot of deep dives into archives. This is in Birmingham, England, where the Anglican Church has its archives. I visited sites in the family history that were important. So this is the grave site outside of Fuzhou where my great-grandfather was buried. And I interviewed all the relatives from my immediate family to more extended relatives in order to find out what happened to the family. But the thing was, once I figured out kind of what happened to them during the Cultural Revolution, well, that just led to more questions. So for every question, for every answer, there was another question. And I found myself getting pushed back further and further into the past and really trying to find out, well, what made my family notable and what was also kind of the root cause of some of their difficulties was the fact that they were Christian. And so if you were Christian in China in the late 19th century or the 20th century, you had contact with Westerners. And that sometimes would both benefit your life but also imperil your life. So I wanted to know, my grandfather and my grandmother were both third-generation Christians. And that led to a question of, well, who was the first? And why in a culture steeped in Buddhism and the philosophies of Taoism and Confucianism, why would anyone embrace Christianity to begin with? So this question then brought me to southern China, to Fujian province, and that's where the Lins are from. We're from a little village in Fujian called Ardu, and there, one of my first stops was the Lin Ancestral Hall. So the Chinese are very big in ancestry and genealogy, and inside the Lin Ancestral Hall in the town of Ardu, I found the page from my family tree in a book called a Jiapu. So every family, every clan has its records in a thick book that's only opened once a year, and it's kept in a wooden box. And so this is the page from my family history. And what I learned is that the first convert was just a fisherman from Ardu who went to Fuzhou, walked there, to work for the missionaries as a cook. And he worked for this man here, Archdeacon Wolf. And so in China at the time, and after the Opium War, China was forced to open up 5 of its ports to foreigners, and that included traders as well as missionaries. And the Anglicans really had a foothold in Fuzhou, along with the Americans. There were many Americans who were there, the Presbyterians were there, the Methodists, but the Anglican Church, this was one of their first stations. And what's interesting, though, is when they first arrived there, I think it was 1861, it took them 10 years to convert one person. And they were focusing on the city of Fuzhou. And then Archdeacon Wolfe shows up, and he was the son of Irish farmers. And he said, "You're wasting your time in the city. Go out to the countryside. Go out to the villages." He goes, "That's where people are really struggling just to get through life day to day. And that's where our message would resonate." So that's what he did, and that's what the Anglicans did. And at some point, you know, my great-great-grandfather, who I call in the book Old Lynn for simplicity's sake, that's when he converted. And he went to work for the missionaries. He had a son, an only son, and this only son went to the Anglican school in Fuzhou. And the missionaries trained him later then to be a doctor. Now back then they didn't have medical schools, at least not then. And so there was a medical missionary by the name of Dr. Birdwood von Summerin Taylor. I love that name. And so Dr. Taylor trained Lin Taoan to be a doctor. And the two of them worked in a small hospital, a mission hospital, in the city of Funing, which was on coastal Fujian province. And what I learned in my research from reading about Dr. Taylor was that 2/3 of the patients at this little hospital were opium addicts. Now think about that. Imagine going to the U of M hospital here and 2/3 of the beds would have been filled with heroin addicts. Opium was destroying Chinese society. Opium was, endemic in Fujian province. And, this caused a real problem for the missionaries because as I read in my missionary readings, oftentimes they would be confronted by people they were trying to convert who would say to them, Chinese people, who would say, "You destroy us with your opium and yet you're trying to save us with your Bible? Which is it?" So it was a real problem for them. Now, in this little town of Funing, there was a teacher who had been educated by the missionaries also, and that was my great-grandmother. And she was the 4th child of a peasant family in mountainous Fujian province. So what would happen back in the late 19th century when the missionaries were opening all these village schools throughout Fujian province is they would go from village to village trying to get students. So when they approached the family of my great-grandmother and said, "We'd like to take your daughter away from home to educate her," they let her go. Why? Well, it's difficult to say because I don't have any written record, but if you're the 4th child of a peasant family and if you're a girl, you're lucky to have any future at all. And your world would have begun and ended in the village where you grew up. So off she went to the girls' school in Funing, and she later then went to a high school in Fuzhou. Now the missionaries were kind of matchmakers. They were not above introducing people, and they wanted their mission-trained men to marry mission-educated girls, women, and so they introduced the two of them and they married. They had 10 children, 6 of whom survived childhood, and the oldest of whom was my grandfather, Lin Puqi. So Lin Puqi, whoops, getting ahead of myself. Lin Puqi was a precocious child. From the age of 10, he attended a school that was run by an Irish missionary. What made this school distinctive in Fuzhou is all the boys were taught in English. So from the age of 10, he was taught in English. And the missionaries later sent him to St. John's University when it was time for college. Now the missionaries knew that they had a problem in China because Christianity was very much associated with the West. And there were many missionaries who were running their operations who were from Europe or America. And they knew that if Christianity was going to take root, that they needed to have Chinese clerics. So they were very much encouraging Lin Puqi to pursue a career as a priest in the Anglican Church. And so in 1918, they sent my grandfather to Philadelphia to attend the Episcopal Seminary in Philadelphia. He also enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania to pursue his graduate degree in philosophy. Now, I'm always amazed, you know, think about that. Within 2 generations, we've gone from illiterate fisherman to Penn graduate student in philosophy. And it was because of education. Now, the missionary experience, as we all know, is kind of a complicated story with many aspects, but the one undeniable thing is that the missionaries really introduced Western education in China. And my grandfather was part of that generation that really benefited from that. So he was also part of this post-1911 generation of young people who wanted to make China strong and knew that what they needed more than anything was a Western education. So when my grandfather arrived in Philadelphia in 1918, taking the SS Nanjing from Shanghai to Yokohama to Honolulu to San Francisco and then to Philadelphia, he had every intention of spending as much time as possible in the United States. He wanted to get his PhD in sacred studies and his PhD in philosophy and return to China to help build the church in China, to work for the Anglican Church. But what happened was he got a letter from home 2 years into his stay from his father, who said to him, "Your younger brother wants to get married, but before he can get married, you have to get married. So come home, I have found a lovely girl for you to marry." So for my grandfather, this posed a great dilemma. Would he pursue his dream of being a modern man and making China strong again and defying his father and just staying in Philadelphia and living out his plan as he saw it? Or would he be a dutiful son and return home and obey his father in the Confucian tradition? So he did what was expected of him and he went home. And they were married in March of 1921, and both of them are incredibly unhappy in this picture. Ignore the smiles. And the reason is my grandmother had a dream of her own. She was going to a boarding school in Shanghai called the McTeer School for Girls. It was run by Southern Methodists, I believe. And she had a dream. She wanted to graduate from high school. She wanted to go to America. She wanted to become a doctor. At the time in China, there were several high-profile Christian women physicians. And so every young Christian girl in China wanted to grow up to be just like Mary Stone, or there were some others who they wanted to be doctors. So my grandmother, Ni Guizhen, was told by her parents to come home. There's an arranged marriage and she has to get married. So she had no choice but to obey. And so she's 18, 19 there, marrying a man she barely knew. I love this photograph too. Look how they colorized it, Joseph. Would you approve? So by marrying into the Nee family, my grandfather was brother-in-law of the younger brother of my grandmother. His name was Watchman Nee. Now, Watchman Nee was a very prominent religious leader in China in the 20th century. He's considered one of the great men among Chinese Christians, along with John Sung and Wang Mingdao. Watchman Nee is right up there. And he was a prolific writer, a charismatic speaker. He had, he had a following of about 80,000 people. What made him different than my grandfather was very much part of the denominational foreign church. Watchman Nee spurned the denominational mission churches, and he wanted to build a more grassroots religious movement. He didn't want to be just part of the Anglican communion, so he would preach on his own, and as I said, he would write for articles, he would write books, and he was widely followed within China. His group was called the Little Flock by outsiders. And, whoops, sorry about that. And they worshiped in house churches. Have you heard about the house church movement in China? You really can date it back to Watchman Nee. So it would be Watchman Nee and like-minded Christians who would get together in people's homes to discuss the Bible. Watchman Nee believed in the authority of the Bible. He believed that people should be born again, and he believed that every individual should be involved in evangelizing. So those were kind of the foundations of his brand of Christianity. But it was very different from my grandfather, who was, again, part of this Anglican tradition. So, 1927, Northern Expedition. This was a very tumultuous time in China. China was not a unified nation. China was very much fragmented, and there were pockets of China that were controlled by warlords. Just a quick little history lesson. During what was called the Northern Expedition, there was an alliance between the nationalists and the communists to fight together to defeat the warlords and to begin the process of unifying China. So did I get that right to the graduate students in the audience? So they had no problem as they were marching north in overtaking Fuzhou, 1927. And so the troops kind of hung around Fuzhou, the communists and the nationalists. And, I was very interested in this period. My grandfather, there he is sitting there, was very much a rising star within Fuzhou and within the missionary community because he's just what they needed. He was an educated Chinese. He became ordained, as a pastor. And he, in the 1920s, he taught at the seminary. He taught at a union college called Fujian Christian University. He was dean of the first cathedral that the Anglicans had in Fuzhou. And he was also a teacher and a principal. So he had many responsibilities, and he was very well known. I love this picture, by the way, because to me, as a writer, since I wasn't there in Fuzhou in 1922, I really had to learn how to read photographs. And this photo tells me a lot, because look at Lin Puqi, just back from Philadelphia, wearing probably a suit he had tailored in Philadelphia. But compare him to the other students or the other faculty members, and he very much, I think, fancied himself a Western cosmopolitan man. So anyway, Lin Puqi was, again, a rising star, but this also made him a marked man, and I'll explain to you why. So, as I mentioned to you, I wanted to write this book as a narrative, what we call narrative nonfiction. And, I'm not a scholar, I am not a theologian, I'm a storyteller, I'm a reporter, and this is what I do. But I rely on people like you, the graduate students in the audience here, because I needed to get a foundation on kind of modern Chinese history from 1860 until the present. So I did a lot of reading, and I picked up a book by Ryan Dunch, a fascinating book for me because it was about Fuzhou Protestants and the making of modern China, 1857-1927. I couldn't wait to read it. And when I read a book like this, I always start with the index. And usually there's always a mention of Watchman Nee because he was very prominent and very, very well known. But in this case, I found a mention of my grandfather, Lin Puqi. And by the way, this is the modern Chinese spelling of his name. And there was, 2 pages where he's mentioned. And I found a single sentence in which Ryan wrote, "The Chinese principal of an Anglican school, the Reverend Lin Puqi, was capped and paraded through the streets, then denounced at a mass meeting." He's describing a protest in 1927 in the wake of the Northern Expedition after the Alliance had conquered the warlord there. And this was the first I'm hearing of this. And so I immediately, there's Lin Puqi, again, another classic photo here with his hat and his white shoes. But I immediately called Ryan. I said, "Ryan, can you share with me your primary source?" And then he directed me to the Yale Seminary archives, to a memoir of an American woman by the name of Ida Bell Lewis. And Ida Bell was a Southern woman who was running a women's college in Fuzhou. And Ida Bell, like many missionary women, would write back to her mother and her sisters and tell them about life in China. And within one of these letters, Ida Bell is describing this incident whereby my grandfather was captured by an anti-foreign, anti-Christian mob and paraded through the streets of Fuzhou for a day. And I found out about it through Ryan's reporting and scholarship, but then I thought to myself, well, if this is something that was so big that Ida Bell is telling mom and sister about it, I wonder if I can find other references to this incident. And so the reporter in me kind of kicked in, and I did what I would do if I was investigating the Philadelphia Housing Authority or something. I began like looking in places where I thought I could find information. So I read missionary magazines. There were many that were published by the Anglican Church, as well as missionaries in general, like the Chinese Recorder, which is a very well-known magazine. And I found multiple accounts. I went through diplomatic reports. At the National Archives in London, I knew that the British embassy had a representative in Fuzhou, and I knew the date of this attack, so I went through the records and I found his report from Fuzhou back to Beijing describing what happened. And as a writer, you know, I'm trying to get the big picture, but as a writer, I want details to bring this incident to life. And I remember the British diplomat in Fuzhou, when he was writing back to the Home Office, he had one little detail. He said there were many people in the mob who had pistols. And to me, that was such an important detail because it kind of ratcheted up the kind of the tension there and how this event could have turned really ugly. But then I also found a newspaper account. Reuters ran a story that ran in the North China Daily. Internal mission correspondence. The bishop in charge in Fuzhou wrote back to the Home Office of the Church Missionary Society and described what happened to Lin Puqi that day. And then I found more personal letters and diaries like Ida Bell. And so this is the Reuters account from the North China Daily, where it describes communist fury at Fuzhou, student outbreak against Christianity, outrage on Chinese pastor. Serious anti-Christian agitation has been started here by communist students who held a meeting yesterday at which the speakers harangued the mob, urging them to overthrow Christianity. The students seized and bound a Chinese pastor, and after placing a fool's cap on his head, paraded him through the foreign quarter past British and American mission buildings. So I'm starting to understand what was happening. I'm gathering details. But as a writer of narrative nonfiction, one of the tenets is you can't make things up. Despite what you may hear about fake news, journalists do not make things up. And so I needed to get inside my grandfather's head. Like I had this image of him being, what happened was the mob captured him because he was such a prominent Chinese Christian in Fuzhou. And they tied his hands with rope, they put a rope around his neck, and they were leading him like a dog through the streets with a dunce cap on his head and a placard on his chest that read, "Running Dog of the Foreigners." Now, many people associate that slogan with the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, but this was 1927. And so I needed to get inside Reverend Lin's head, like what was he thinking? And in one of the letters that I found in my research from an American who was president of Fujian Christian University, John Gowdy was writing back to the Home Office. And in it he says, that there were people around Lin Puqi who asked him, the mob, they asked him if he was a Christian, to which he said yes. Then they said they would free him if he would renounce his faith, to which he replied, "I will never renounce my faith. You may kill me if you want to." So suddenly John Gowdy is telling me like what was in Lin Puqi's head, and he's actually giving me a direct quote from the mouth of Lin Puqi. But I really struck gold. I found my Rosetta Stone really in a memoir by Reverend Pakenham Walsh. He was the Irish missionary who started the school for boys that Lin Puqi attended as a 10-year-old. And at the Yale Seminary Library, I found on the shelves a thin little memoir that Reverend Walsh wrote about his 20 years in China. And I had no idea what would be inside, so I pulled it off the shelf. I opened it up, and I found a photograph of my grandfather standing there in Fuzhou. Reverend Walsh had written his memoir, and in it had a chapter on my favorite students. And one of them was Lin Puqi. And it turns out that in 1935, they were corresponding. And in one of these long letters, Lin Puqi described what happened. And Pakenham Walsh wrote that when an American offered help, Reverend Lin said this was purely a Chinese affair and he wished to fight it out himself. He began to pray in silence for the mob of students round about him, and from that moment, he said, all fear left my heart. and he spoke out quietly and boldly that Christianity was not a foreign faith, but the completion of all that the great Chinese sages had looked forward to, and that he would never deny his Lord and Master. So thank you, Reverend Walsh, because suddenly he's bringing me inside the head of my grandfather and telling me what was happening as he was experiencing this day of agony. So on with the tale. Reverend Lin decided to move the family to Shanghai in 1932. Precisely why, I'm not sure, but in my research, I concluded that he probably decided that he was no longer being effective in Fuzhou. Because after this 1927 incident, there was another time where he was the target of a protest. And he was always being singled out as the running dog of the foreigners. I thought, in my research too, Reverend Lin was getting impatient with the rate of change in China. And he felt that the Chinese should be more in charge of the church in China. And I know this because the bishop was writing about the Home Office, telling them that Lin Puqi was leaving, and said, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. So anyway, Lin Puqi relocated in Shanghai in 1932 and could not have picked a worse time because the Japanese had just bombed a district of Shanghai, so there was war all around. And this is my father, the youngest of the three Lin boys. So when they lived in Shanghai, there was years of just constant conflict. There was 1932 after Japan attacked Shanghai. 1937, you have the Sino-Japanese War. 1941, Second World War. 1945, Chinese Civil War. So people of my father's generation knew nothing but conflict in their lives and war. Lin Puqi, who is standing right there next to the Bishop Roberts, I believe, he was pastor of a church in Shanghai, an Episcopal church. He was editor of a Chinese language magazine for Christians called the Chinese Churchman. And his paying job was he worked for the Shanghai Municipal Council as a principal for a boys' school. At the same time, Watchman Nee was in Shanghai. And his ministry was growing by leaps and bounds in the 1930s. He had an assembly hall in Shanghai that could accommodate more than 1,000 people. Across China, he had about 80,000 followers, and because he could write in English, and because he was a prolific writer, he traveled a lot overseas. He traveled to Southeast Asia, to Singapore, to the Philippines. He traveled to England to meet with the Brethren, which was a group in England. He traveled to the United States too. And his flock, the little flock, was growing. There is a professor at Duke Seminary, Lian Shi, who wrote a book about Watchman Nee and other indigenous church leaders in China. And really, Professor Lian puts it beautifully, and since I can't say it better, I will quote for you how he described Watchman Nee's church, his following. He said that the foundation of his teaching was a revelation of the hidden design of human history, which, like a majestic cosmic clock, ticked precisely and inexorably toward a divine-appointed apocalyptic climax. That revelation rendered all the contemporary chaos and evil in the world intelligible. So the argument that Professor Lian presents is that because of the chaos in China, all the war happening all around, people were looking for spiritual guidance, for solace, and that was one of the appeals of Watchman Nee and his little flock. There was also very much kind of a real patriotism in China. You could call it nationalism, but there was a sense that China needed to be strong. You know, you've heard about Make America Great Again. Well, this was kind of Make China Great Again. And there was a certain segment of society that gravitated more towards the Chinese-led indigenous religious movement of Watchman Nee versus the foreign-led denominational church of my grandfather, Reverend Lin. So it was during this period of chaos where Watchman Nee's little flock was really gaining in followers. What's interesting is when they moved back to Shanghai, my grandmother liked her younger brother, and so she was very curious about the work he was doing at his assembly. So she started going to his Shanghai Christian Assembly Hall on Sundays. Then she went back, and then she went back again. And there came a time where she announced to her husband, Reverend Lin, the assistant pastor, that she decided she would no longer go with him to church, on Sundays, but she preferred going to her brother's assembly hall. Now, this went over like a bomb. And my grandfather would yell and say, "What will people think? You can't stop going to my church. You play the organ for me." And she said, basically, "I don't care. This is where I feel more at home." And why do I know this? Well, because they didn't keep it quiet within the family house, and they would yell about it all the time. So all the kids knew that there was this rift. And the rift kind of played out among the family members. So there was St. Peter's Church, which is shown here, and this is one of the assembly halls for the little flock. This one's actually in Fujian. And so for the kids, they had to decide where they would go. So the boys went with their father to the Episcopal Anglican Church on Sundays, and my Aunt Martha went with her mother to Watchman Nee's assembly. And I asked Martha, I said, what was the appeal? I mean, why were so many people gravitating towards Watchman Nee? And she said, he had a very calm way of speaking. He was not fire and brimstone. And he had a way of explaining very complicated concepts in simple language through stories. And that's why he had this following of, close to 100,000 people across China. So 1949, as we all know, that was the liberation. The Communist Party won the Civil War. And my father, who was a student at St. John's University studying medicine, left for the United States, where he continued his medical training at Atlantic City Memorial Hospital. So he had every intention of returning to China because his dream was to become the second neurosurgeon in China. At the time, 1949, China of a population of 400 million, there was one brain surgeon in Beijing. So Dad wanted to go back to Shanghai to become the second neurosurgeon, but he met my mother, and the rest, they say, is history. So moving on with the story. So my grandparents were still in Shanghai, and my father's sister and brother. And my grandfather was always trying to, as I mentioned before, change the church from within the system. He really did spend his life trying to make Christianity more Chinese. He wrote about this. He agitated against the control of the Anglican hierarchy. And so when China became the People's Republic of China, he was still holding out hope that things would be okay. So in 1949, December, Reverend Lin was part of 19 religious leaders who wrote a letter to the missions. And in it, they said, the Chinese church will not emerge through this historical change unaffected. It will suffer a purge, and many of the withered branches will be amputated. But we believe it will emerge stronger and purer in quality, a more fitting witness to the gospel of Christ. This was his belief on the advent of the creation of the People's Republic of China. What he didn't realize is that he would become one of the withered branches. So at the time, the communist regime did not close churches when they took over in 1949. Churches were free to operate. But there was a process that they called finding common ground, where the regime was basically beginning to exert control over churches, and Christians, Christian leaders, church leaders, were beginning to toe the line. So in 1951, Zhou Enlai called a meeting in Beijing attended by church leaders, including Watchman Nee, not my grandfather, and the purpose of this meeting was to talk about the future of churches in China. But at the end of the meeting, they had a denunciation session where 7 Christians were singled out, 3 foreign and 4 Chinese, to be denounced. And so one of them was the bishop who was in charge of the Anglican Church, Reverend Y.Y. Tzu, who happened to be my grandfather's mentor and close friend from the time that he was at St. John's University. So Reverend Lin was forced to stand before the congregation at his church, before 1,000 people, and publicly denounce his mentor and friend. Because in China, it was not enough to just say you were patriotic, you had to show it. So he got up and he basically said that, what his friend Y.Y. Tzu was now thoroughly Americanized, so he was bad. I mean, Y.Y. Tzu was married to a Chinese American woman, And so Reverend Lin had to prove that he was loyal to the new regime. At the same time, 1952, Watchman Nee was arrested. He was charged with economic crimes, accused of being a spy. They attacked his reputation. He was a vagabond. And he was sentenced in 1956 to 20 years in a labor camp. Now, the reason the regime targeted him for charges of being a counter-revolutionary, it was not because of his beliefs as a Christian. It was more because of what he represented. He was someone who could influence the ideas of about 80,000 people, and the regime was not convinced that he was totally on board. And so what they were afraid of is that he could somehow lead some sort of revolt against the regime. Why do I know this? Well, I know this because a scholar at Pace University was able to find a document that the Public Security Bureau sent out right before they had a trial of Watchman Nee, which kind of lays this out. But another reason I know that it was more political than religious is in October of 1955, so just a few months before Watchman Nee was formally tried, the Public Security Bureau showed up at the family house. And they searched the family house. And what were they looking for? They were looking for weapons. You know, as if my grandfather and grandmother would have, you know, a cache of pistols under the floorboards. But, so it was very much a political threat. And again, I mentioned at the outset that the only way we knew what was happening at home was through the letters that my grandfather would send, but those were all sanitized. And so in 1953, when he wrote the first letter to my mother, who would soon be marrying his son, he was just saying, you know, how he approved of their marriage, and he ended the letter with this seemingly innocuous statement that said, as you know, I'm not engaged in church work now, I'm resting, you know, I occupy myself with one thing or another, including babysitting my granddaughters. And at first this seemed so benign, but it took me years really of research to understand what he was telling us. He was 59 years old. He was at the height of he should have been at the height of his career within the church organization. And he's basically telling us that he spends his day, you know, filling in as a preacher and taking care of his grandkids. And the reason was 1953, tail end of the Korean War. We call it the Korean War. In China, it was the war to resist America and aid Korea. And my grandfather, who's standing right there, was very much aligned with the Episcopal Church, which was the American church. And so not only did he have sons who were in America, he was, you know, working for the, you know, remnants of the American church, and he had a brother-in-law who was counter-revolutionary. So for my grandfather, he was shunted aside. Now, within China at the time, there was, you know, in terms of the church, there was something called the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, and that was really the official church. And so all you know, churches had to join the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, but there were many followers of Watchman Nee who decided they didn't want to do that, so they would practice in what they called the underground church. Another letter and another example of how my grandfather kept us in the dark was this letter in November 1966, where, you know, all of a sudden he's writing to us in Chinese. And he says, you know, we're fine, don't worry about us, and don't send that birthday gift. Birthday gift was code for money that we would wire to him via an aunt in Hong Kong. So he's like telling us, you know, no more money. And the reason is, well, August of 1966 was when the house was ransacked and the interrogations began of my grandmother. So this is what he wasn't telling us. You know, as I mentioned, the Cultural Revolution was a very difficult time. I'm speeding along now because I see that 5 minutes to 1. So I did kind of cover that, you know, it was a very difficult time for them. And, you know, in my reporting of what was happening during the Cultural Revolution, I focused a lot on my cousin, who was my age, who was sent to the countryside and became a barefoot doctor. She was delivering babies at the age of 16. When we arrived in China in 1979, was there any doubt that no one wanted to talk to us? I mean, the Cultural Revolution had just ended in 1976. The scars from that were still very raw. So when we got there, it was only Uncle George who would tell us. And it took me literally 40 years to kind of piece the family story together. You know, when we were in China in June of '79, they reopened churches because up until then, churches had been closed. But there was still a lot of fear among my relatives to return to church because they weren't sure, you know, if the bad times couldn't come back. Again, I'm going to speed along a little bit here and talk about, you know, the legacy of Reverend Lin and Watchman Nee. I was alive and well when I returned to Fuzhou in 2015. And I actually went to my grandfather's old church, back here in Fuzhou, which is still standing. You can tell the Anglican style. And then I went to a house church where these people were still singing the songs of Watchman Nee and reading his works. And this man had been in prison for 20 years because he was a follower of Watchman Nee. And he said to me when I met him, he goes, if you and I were meeting just 10 years ago, I would have been in trouble. But in Fujian at that time, there was a kind of peaceful coexistence. A big question now is whether that sort of peaceful coexistence will survive because President Xi has instituted new rules regarding churches. So 1949, there were 4 million Christians, of which 3 million were Catholics. So the Protestants, despite 100 years of work in China, only had 1 million followers. Today, there are about 100 million Christians in China, but that's the unofficial and the official churches. And there are some predictions that, you know, the number could easily double in the next decade or so. And the reason is that, you know, people are looking for kind of spiritual guidance. And it's not only Christianity that is flourishing, but it's also Buddhism, the study of Confucianism and Taoism. All sorts of religion and philosophies like that are gaining followers and people who are looking for some sort of spiritual guidance. So I'm rushing. But as I mentioned, with the new rules against the new rules for churches that have been instituted just this year by President Xi, there is a lot of anxiety, especially among the house churches of China. And there are a lot of people who wonder if the government could decide to clamp down on the house church movement. So that is my family saga. And thank you for listening. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So, anyone? Yes?
So this is another journalist, but I read recently in a paper that there was a prediction that there were actually more Christians today in China than the population of the United States.
So the projection is that by 2030, there could be more Christians in China than in the United States. So who knows? The numbers are kind of squishy because the government keeps a record of official members of official churches, but there are many more people who are not part of that official church. They practice in house churches. So it's really impossible to know. Everything is a projection. There's a professor at Purdue who does a good job of doing this, Professor Yang. So no one really knows. But more importantly, I think, is the trajectory, is there's growth. And it has been continuing for the last 20 years, and it's just on a steady path. So that's why people think there could be a doubling in the number of Christians in the next 10 years or so.
I think it would be hard to count. Here in the United States, there are many Chinese Christian house churches.
Right, yeah, all over. I mean, there's one in Philadelphia, I'm sure. And a lot of those people are followers of Watchman Nee. Anyone else? Yes.
I think if you know the Chinese history, you will know that almost every dynasty was end with something associated with religions. Okay, and that's why I think that the CCP kind of control, no matter how much the number is, they control each religion's members, and they watch it very closely. So from that prospect, I think how you feel about your family that sacrifice so much to the religion that you believe.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's why when I was talking about the arrest of Watchman Nee, that it was political. They didn't want him like inciting the members of the little flock to turn against the government, and that's why they looked at the family. You know, they searched the family home looking for weapons. You know, thinking that there's some armed insurrection that they're planning, that my grandmother was planning. In terms of how I feel about the family, I mean, the amazing thing about this book is the process of learning who my grandparents were. Because I only knew them through these letters, and I got to know them intimately. And one of the things that overwhelmed me is I was witness to their faith. So my grandfather, who was, you know, taunted by a mob and physically in danger, how he held strong. My grandmother, you know, basically defied her husband by not going to his church, stood up to him, but also during the Cultural Revolution, she never broke. She never turned on Watchman Nee, and that's one reason why physically she was harmed a lot. So, you know, in my book, I just kind of write how if it was me, I'm not sure I would have been so strong, but to witness through others her faith was, you know, a very awe-inspiring thing. So in terms of how I feel about the family, it's like I now know my grandparents, and I respect them tremendously. Anyone else? Yes?
What's the proportion of Catholics to other Christian denominations now?
So before it was majority Catholic, but now it's much lower. And maybe Joseph can help me with the Catholic numbers, because I'm not sure today, percentage-wise. I think it's reversed. I think it's more like a third would be Catholic.
Protestants are growing in number faster than Catholics.
Yeah. And so there's a recent agreement between the Vatican and China, where now the Vatican is going to be more involved in the appointment of bishops in China. It's a little fuzzy still how it's all going to work out, but there is kind of movement towards some sort of rapprochement between the Vatican and the CCP. So I will hang around to answer questions for anyone, but thank you very much. I know we have to vacate this room, so thank you.